We've seen various projections for the prison population, and it's pretty clear that there's going to be a significant growth, potentially, if we look forward, really in the long term, to very significant numbers by 2025 and beyond. Do any of you sort of argue with the projections themselves, with the figures?
Well, up to a point, because if you look at the projections that have been done, which I did do in preparation for this, from 2010 onwards, the projections are pretty inaccurate and crude. And one of the points I wanted to make to you was that I think this is an area that needs much better scrutiny, the way in which the ministry prepares its projections, and particularly the problem is because it takes 5 years to build a prison from getting planning permission to opening it. 5 years is a period over which the projections are particularly flaky. So I think over time it's very difficult to be sure. I would hope that the very high prison population that is, the high level for 2027 at 106,000. I think that's very unlikely, but where it will be, the range is a very, very big one, and I think this is the basic underlying problem is for planning capacity is the inaccuracy and difficulty in doing meaningful projections.
Okay. And yes, so that's 106,000 projected by March 2027.
That's the high end, so there's a low, medium and high.
Yeah, okay. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I was looking at the numbers prior to the Lord Chancellor's announcement in October. Yeah. And at that point, it did seem that the numbers were pretty much on track for at least the 2025 projection. Okay. What I think makes it particularly complicated in the longer term is, first of all, the impact of the changes in the sentencing bill to people convicted of rape and other offences, and what the long-term consequences of that will be, and also whether some of the other measures that might reduce the population, such as those for short sentences, what effect they will have. So since the projections were done, which of course, as Rob says, the further you get away from the current date, the more difficult they become, there have been other changes to sentencing policy which will have an effect.
Mr. Garside,
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, and maybe a slightly different view. I think the projections are often inaccurate, but they broadly indicate the trajectory. What tends to happen is that the actual prison population tends to undershoot what the projection is saying, but the broad magnitudes are not necessarily way out. And certainly if we look forward, certainly the projections for the coming years do look rather alarming. I agree that hopefully we won't be hitting anything close to 106,000, but that's a political choice. And I think, as we've already seen with the Lord Chancellor's announcement in mid-October, which I'm sure we'll come on to, as a result of those rather alarming projections, the government have taken some decisions which might actually ensure that those alarming projections don't come true. So, whatever the projections are saying, the actualities are as much as anything a political choice. It depends on a number of decisions made by ministers and others to try to mitigate those situations.
I get a sense from all of you there are some caveats around the process, but all in all, clearly there's an increase of some significance, but it's not quite
a significant increase. Clearly, there's going to be a significant increase.
Okay, whatever view. Okay, thanks. Yeah, James, Mr. Daly.
I wanted to ask one question based upon personal experience. That when I was practicing the courts over the last 2 decades, one thing that has become extremely noticeable is the lack of people appearing before the courts for offences such as shoplifting. When I was appearing before the courts, I could perhaps be representing 10 people a day, and it was more than likely if they were recidivist offenders, the whole 10 would be going down to prison for very short periods of time. Now, that level of that section of people receiving custodial sentences appears to have been taken out of the justice system somewhat. And I just wondered if you've seen, in terms of any of the projections or any of the viewpoints as to where we are going, whether that has been taken into account.
I think it has been. It is clear that over a period of time, the numbers of people doing short sentences which is where your shoplifters might have ended up, has reduced quite sharply over the last decade. Right? So what's driving the increase, it's important to be clear about, is not that we are sending more people to prison. It's that we are sending people to prison for longer. Right? And in particular, for those sort of mid-range and more serious offences, that we're now, I think it was the Prime Minister himself said that sentencing had increased by about 2/3. Sentence lengths had increased by 2/3. That's what's driving the increase, not that we're sending more people to prison. And indeed, for some of those very minor offences, they aren't going to prison. The numbers going for short sentences have reduced.
And just one very brief question. How do you put, as I won't say academics, but as learned scholars in this particular area, how do you think the system takes into account the mind of a magistrate or the mind of a judge? Because what I'm trying to say is that in different courts, different...
Yes.
How can I put it? Attitudes to sentencing are clear, I think, from the people who've experienced the criminal courts. And it's not a standardised viewpoint of how each sentencing bench or sentencing judge approaches the individual in front of them, is it?
We do have sentencing guidelines now, of course, which mean that while they should not necessarily, act as constrain what magistrates and judges want to do, they definitely are there to provide some clear limits and some clear steps in how they should reach decision making. So courts throughout the land should adopt the same step-by-step approach to reaching a decision. I mean, my own view is that the big rise in the prison population that we have seen and are likely to see, in part, reflects a failure of those guidelines to do enough, because we have seen more people getting custodial sentences of those who are convicted, and a rise in the average length of those custodial sentences. The sentencing guidelines, in a sense, were introduced to prevent that, or to act as a sort of brake on that. And I have some concerns that, in a sense, that hasn't worked institutionally.
And any contribution? Yeah.
Well, just for me, I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, I was reading the impact assessment of the measures to reduce short sentences and what the impact of that would be on population. And one of the factors that the impact assessment takes into account is up-tariffing, what they describe as up-tariffing. So judges want someone to go to, a magistrate wants someone to go to serve a custodial sentence. They don't want to give them a sentence of less than a year, so they give them a sentence of 15 months instead. So there's a risk of up-tariffing. But the projections specifically took into account magistrates' behaviour in that regard, or what they think might be magistrates' behaviour.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, we're getting to, on any view, we're at the stage where we've had an increase, and we're getting close to the usable limit, for want of a better word, of prison places already, and that could go yet further. Now, those pressures were being predicted back in 2020. I suppose the question is, should more have been done by government to anticipate this before the measures that we've been talking about recently?
I mean, the government certainly were taking steps. I mean, we can think about, the prison estate transformation programme. We can think about the more recent prison building programme. So kind of in a sense, the government was aware that there were potentially capacity pressures coming up, and they'd started taking steps to address it. The question really is, were they any good at delivering that? We all know that actually there are very few prison places delivered under the Prison Estate Transformation Programme. And the current programme is somewhat mired in local planning disputes and all the rest. So, it's not that the government wasn't doing anything. Whether they were doing the right things, on the other hand, is, I think, a good point. Now, it was an unfortunate timing that the beginnings of these rather alarming projections came right in the middle of COVID lockdown. So maybe the government and prison service were focused on other things. And to be fair, they could have looked and said, well, from about 2017 the prison population was starting to decline, and certainly under COVID it declined again quite sharply, and that probably bought them a bit of time. But yeah, I mean, I think there's been a bit of complacency since then. And my real concern is there doesn't really seem to be any, the main game in show seems to be that we legislate and we pursue policies which we know are going to create some upward pressures on the prison population, and then we rush around trying to service that population either by, increasing overcrowding or by furiously trying to build prison places. The notion that instead we should be thinking, what is an appropriate size of the prison population we should have, we build and maintain accordingly, and then we legislate accordingly, so that we don't get into these kind of cycles of crisis and crisis reaction. That still seems to not be something which is particularly forward. I know it's something this committee's looked at, but within the kind of the political class as a whole, that kind of option doesn't really seem to be very front and centre in any considerations.
Mr. Hardwick?
Well, I mean, I've got a bit of concern about how well the Ministry of Justice really understand what's going on. I mean, I was surprised when the Lord Chancellor gave his statement on the 16th of October that he said the reason the prison population is nearly double the level it was 3 decades ago is not principally because of the growth in the sentenced population. I mean, I don't know if he misspoke, but I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that it is principally because of the growth in the sentenced population. Sure, in the recent past, we've seen this large increase in remand prisons that has put particular overcrowding pressures on local jails, Birmingham, Leeds, the London prisons that take people directly from court. Yes, that's an important factor. Recall is an important factor. But it's this sentencing, the way in which the going rate, if you like, has gone up so drastically. And just to sort of slightly disagree with Nick, although it isn't more people coming into the system, part of these projections do reflect 20,000 new police officers, and with a very crude, I think, equation, more police equals more people brought before the courts equals more prison. Now, I've never seen the methodology, but clearly if you've got a higher going rate and then you start to pump in more people, that is when the thing starts to become apocalyptic, really.
Professor Hardwick,
No, I mean, I think I don't disagree with Rob. My point about was what had happened up to now in terms of sentences getting longer. I'm sure Rob's right there. With more police, that will also have some impact on overall prison numbers. I mean, I would be quite critical of the government. I think the fact there was going to be a significant increase was very predictable. I mean, I teach about prisons, and I was, about this time last year, I was teaching my students, and around this time in October 2023, we would hit the ceiling. It was predictable because it's baked in. Because, if you've got this number of people that are serving this length of sentence, that element of the increase is baked in. There'll be other extraneous factors on top of that, but the population is going to increase. And I think it's not, one of the things I would say, that the capacity issue is not simply a question of physical prison space. It's also a question of whether you've got the staff that you need to manage that number of prisoners safely and securely, and all the other facilities that you want. And I think it was possible to see this coming, and I think it would have been possible to have taken action earlier to mitigate some of the effects.
That's helpful. Mr. Garside, can I ask specifically to you? We talked a bit about data, for example. Does HMPPS have the data that it really needs to understand the demands? And are there better ways we could use data? What more data should there be? How should it be used better?
Well, I mean, the Prison Population Management Unit at HMPPS, I mean, it's going to work with a variety of data. I mean, crudely, the strategic data, so the projections, the long-term projections that we've already talked about, and then tactical data, information from given prisons, given regions, a degree of intelligence about what's going on in court areas, what might be coming down the chute, as it were. And, I mean, I suspect, and Rob's hinted at this earlier, I suspect there probably it's certainly possible to develop more sophisticated models for how we predict prison population in the long term. And there's probably arguments about how HMPPS could have better systems for collecting and collating that data. But of course that would require investment. It would require money to do that. I think the real problem at the moment that HMPPS has at the moment is because capacity is just so tight. It's very difficult to do demand management and demand planning beyond just, can we get through the rest of this day? Can we get to the end of this week? And sort of moving people around the system and not necessarily moving the right prisoners to the right prisons, because you're simply just trying to find a few spaces here, a few spaces there. So by all means, you could certainly have better systems for managing and collating that data. But if HMPPS is effectively continuously on crisis management mode, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to have a strategic approach.
Okay. General agreement there. Thanks. Mr. Timpson.
Thank you, Chair. Can we have a little bit more closer look at the Lord Chancellor's statement on the 16th of October last year and some of the measures that were set out there, to get your take on whether you think that's going to have a discernible impact on the pressures on prison capacity? And we've touched already a little bit on the suspending of short sentences and the fact that over the last decade there has been a fall of 43%, I believe, in short sentences. So bearing that in mind, what effect do you think that measure of a default against a short sentence, as it were, because there's still the ability of a judge or tribunal to make a short sentence in certain situations? What impact is that going to have, first of all, on the prison population?
I think just checking, the impact assessment on that suggests something in the range of 200 to 1,000 prison places. So it's not huge. In steady state, that's what's predicted.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Insofar as I can judge, it looks. I mean, it won't be that huge. I would be surprised if the impact was greater than 1,000 at any rate.
And when you say 200 to 1,000, is that over what period?
I mean, that's in steady state.
Okay.
So like
it's
it builds up
basis.
to that. So once in steady state, that's what they're predicting.
I mean, that's obviously a big range, isn't it? I think it betrays the fact that the government aren't very sure how courts will respond to this presumption, the number of cases that they will in fact suspend, or the ones that they say, oh, well, these are exceptional cases that we're not going to suspend. I mean, there is some evidence from Scotland who've had this presumption for some time, and I don't think it's had quite the impact that they had hoped. There are still pretty large numbers of people going for short sentences, and although you're right to say the numbers have come down in recent years, I mean, there's still 6,000 cases a year that go for sort of 3 months or less in England and Wales. So I think there is some scope for doing it. Other point, yes, it won't necessarily make a big impact on the stock, if you like, on any one day of numbers. But in terms of local prisons processing people in and out, they come for a few days or a few weeks, and they take up a space and then they leave. That does put a pressure on the prison service that is it's a qualitative pressure as well as a quantitative one, if you like, so I think that needs to be factored in terms of the potential benefit to the prison service if more of these cases don't come to prison.
Could we also look at the potential impact or pressure on not the prisoners' capacity to deal with the number of prisoners going in and out, but also the community services and probation, and something that some of you will know a fair amount about from past roles. The range of 200 to 1,000, clearly, if it's the top end of that, that may have quite a significant impact on the ability of probation to provide the necessary services, as well as things like housing, mental health services and so on. What do you think we should be concerned about?
I think it will certainly create a pressure on probation, and probation is pretty sickly as a service itself, I think. I think one of the advantages is that for some other services, it will not disrupt the continuity of care in the way that short sentences do. So, for instance, if you take a housing provider, What won't be happening so much is someone goes into prison for a short period of time, they aren't paying their rent, they lose their accommodation, and new accommodation has to be found with them when they leave, which is work for everybody involved. Some of those things, that's one of the advantages of getting rid of short sentences, some of those things are not just better for the prisoner, but they will take some pressure off those wider services as well. So if probation can cope, I think that, leaving aside its impact on prison places, reducing the number of people doing short sentences is a good thing, I think.
We go on to another one of the measures that was floated, I think. Is probably.
Could I just come in on probation briefly? Yeah. I mean, it's just to build on what Nick said. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in his last report, I think the Chief Inspector of Probation described the probation service as having chronic staff shortages. I'm sure we'll come on and talk about staffing shortages in the prison system and how the plans to build new prisons really need to take account of that. But probation has its own staffing crisis in a sense, and really the findings in the annual report of the Chief Inspector were pretty dismal in terms of the performance. So the ability of that service to take on a tranche of people, sure, the impact assessment says there will be £40 million worth of investment, but actually, how to use that, how to employ people, train them, get them ready, it's a big undertaking.
It's a big undertaking before we then look at these additional measures and the extra capacity that they may require. Looking at another measure was around the potential of renting prison capacity outside of the UK. First of all, are there any potential benefits? Some of them may be obvious in terms of just on the numbers, but are there some potential benefits to that approach?
Well, if I start, I have to say I've been in this arena of criminal justice for a long time, and nothing really surprises me much. But this one, I was really, flabbergasted when I read that this was a sort of serious proposal that somebody who is sentenced in this jurisdiction, it's not clear to me whether they will choose to serve that sentence or whether there'll be a compulsion to go. But I think that the upside is the government say that 600 people can be housed in a foreign jurisdiction at the cost of £24 million a year plus healthcare costs, as I read it. But I just think the downsides in terms of knowing about how those people are going to be dealt with, inspecting them, ensuring that their families are able to maintain contact. The examples that the Lord Chancellor gave of previous experiences within Europe, well, one of them hasn't actually started yet, Denmark sending people to Kosovo, and as I understand it, that plan is only for foreign national prisoners who are going to be deported at the end of the sentence. So it's possible that if our plan in England and Wales is to locate people who are going to be leaving the country, that's one thing, but I haven't seen that undertaking. So I don't think it's really a very legitimate way of running a penal system to transfer people in that way.
It was Norway and Belgium.
That's right. They sent people to
the system up.
Yes, they had people in the Netherlands and two separate prisons. Cambridge University did an evaluation of one of those schemes and found it was not straightforward. The clash of cultures between the prison staff, the expectations, who's responsible for what stays the responsibility, in our case of HMPPS, what is devolved to the host nation, if you like. Very problematic, not just in terms of legal and technical terms, but culturally, I think. So I see quite a heavy debit on that.
Yeah, and I think certainly the Norwegian example, the Norwegian Parliamentary Ombudsman did a review of that scheme back in 2017. And they raised a number of concerns. They talked about lack of adequate protections against torture and ill treatment. They talked about inadequate safeguarding of prisoner health, and they talked about lack of resettlement support, an obvious one, certainly, if we're thinking about prisoners who are going to be coming out of a prison in one jurisdiction and trying to return to another. And I think the main thing for all of this, whether it's a good idea or a workable idea or not, and I kind of think it probably isn't, it's really important if the government is serious about pursuing this, and I'm not sure it is actually a serious proposition, that fact, but if the government is serious about pursuing it, they need to be clear that they don't, that doesn't mean that they can get away from discharging their obligations, both nationally and internationally, in relation to their obligations towards prisoners in terms of their international obligations around human rights, in terms of national laws and rules and all the rest. And so seeking to try to manage a number of prisoners in another jurisdiction and take responsibility for that situation, is very, very difficult. In the case of the Norway example, for example, Norway actually sent an experienced governor who effectively governed the prison in Holland, where a lot of these prisoners were held. So it's going to be a kind of a... If I was trying to find 300 or 400 places in the British prison system, I could certainly think of better ways and more cheaper and more effective ways of doing it than trying to offshore prisoners in Estonia or wherever they end up.
That sort of leads me into the final question, if I may, Chair.
Yes,
tranche. Imagine you are the Lord Chancellor. It may fill you with great thrill, it may fill you with great horror. But you're pressed with this issue of prison capacity and trying to alleviate the pressure. We've had the Lord Chancellor's statement, he's come up with his proposals. But what more do you think, from your own different experiences, could be done? And something was touched on there about 300 or 400 other places that you may be able to find still within the jurisdiction. What are the other proposals that you think they could consider, or you as Lord Chancellor, as I've just appointed you, could consider to try and reduce the pressure on the prison state as it is today, but also in the longer term?
And I think there's a kind of a few things that we can do. This committee has produced a report recently on the IPP sentence. The government has decided it doesn't want to pursue the resentencing exercise. I think we just need to keep talking about that because, we've got at the moment over 1,000 IPP prisoners who are in prison for 5 years or more over tariff, 600 on 10 years or more over tariff, and about 60 or 70 who are 15 years or more over tariff. If the government would actually just do something rather more energetic to expedite the release of IPP prisoners who are over tariff, I think that could make quite a big impact on the prison population quite quickly. Recall is something that is another obvious area. Back in 1993, there were under 100 prisoners in custody under recall. It's now in the thousands. So some relatively small tweaks to the way that the recall regime works potentially could stop potentially hundreds of prisoners being recalled to custody every year. The remand population will probably start falling as from its current high level. But again, decisions about which prisoners are being remanded to custody pre-trial and trying to do more about that. I think that's just another area. And I think the early release scheme, which, when the Justice Secretary announced it, there seemed to be an immediate slight dip in the prison population. But since then, it seems to be more or less in line with what we see this time of year anyway, where it tends to fall in the run-up to Christmas. The end of custody release programme that Labour introduced in the late noughties, there were, I think it was like 80 or 90,000 prisoners ultimately benefited from that scheme. So I think maybe a slightly more energetic early release scheme, which doesn't, at the moment, my sense is it's not quite happening as energetically as it could. Again, that could potentially free up certainly 10s or 20s or 30s of prison places each week.
I think if you look at the figures, I think the measures that they've taken so far, actually including the early release scheme, have had some impact and have brought them some breathing space. There was a bit of a worrying sign that after an initial dip in November, the numbers were starting to climb again and then went down as they often do in Christmas. So it's still too early to say. But I think at the very least they bought themselves some time. Right? The difficulty the Lord Chancellor's got is that the actions of his, or the policies of his predecessors, have baked the increase into the system because it's longer sentences. But there are some things that they're sort of starting to hint at that they could do that would have a more significant impact. So first of all, I think there's the question of how much of a sentence a prisoner has to serve before they're released on licence. And as you know, a lot of cases that's been moved from 6 months, from half the sentence to 2/3. You could reverse that down again. That would have a big impact. You could certainly do, which he suggested in his October statement, looking at the discount for an early guilty plea. Right? I think you have to be quite careful about who that affects, because one of the interesting issues came out the Lamy report is that tended to not work so well for black prisoners, but you could do things about that, and that would have an impact if you did it. So I think the big wins would be taking, in a sense, using some procedural measures to reverse the increases in very long sentences. And you can do that around how long does somebody have to serve, and what discount you get for an early guilty plea. That would produce some big wins. Now, there are obvious disadvantages to that. There are lots of, I can see some good reasons why you didn't do that, but the governors to choose, there's some choices. The increases that they are proposing in the prison estate is going to cost them £4 billion. Any government after the election is going to have to think about whether that's a priority for public expenditure. So I think looking hard at these alternatives, unpalatable though to some degree they might be, is something that's going to have to happen. Because even if at the moment they don't, if we're even starting to head towards some of the upper projections, there's no plans to build at the moment places to cope with that sort of a level of increase, and you can't see it happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I haven't seen the figures. So this 18-day release system that was introduced in the middle of October is in fact based on releasing prisoners on compassionate grounds. So presumably older, unwell prisoners. But I haven't seen any specific numbers on that. The numbers on home detention curfew have gone up a little bit since the middle of October, so we have seen some benefit there. I mean, just one point I'd add, I mean, we're going to come on, I think, and talk about the supply side changes and more prisons and so on in due course, but I do think an opportunity has been missed to kind of diversify the way, the kind of infrastructure in which people can be held. What do I mean by that? There was a lot of talk 6, 7, 8 years ago about doing better on the mental health side and being able to transfer more people with mental illness who are in prisons into secure, low secure, medium secure, high secure forensic beds. Has there been an expansion of that estate? I don't think so. I think there's still about 7,500 forensic secure beds, which there were 5 or 6 years ago. So that, I mean, in a sense, if you're Lord Chancellor, you could try and have a word with your colleague in health about that. The other thing is, and you mentioned probation. In 2021, some approved premises, a new approved premises hostel was opened in Bristol, I think it was. And I couldn't believe when I read that this was the first new one for 30 years, the first new bail probation hostel. And there is a modest programme to create 200 places, I think, in approved premises. Should we not be investing rather more of the $4 billion that are going into prisons into this alternative infrastructure to provide courts and HMPPS and other relevant authorities with a greater range of options which don't just mean prison?
Okay, thanks. Okay.
So just to say, on the question of the end of custody licence, I looked at the figures for 2010 when it was last in operation, and those figures are published. And that was showing about a sort of steady state impact of about 1,000 is what it achieved. And that would be worth, now I'm not sure the degree to which the current scheme replicates the 2010 one, but it's worth noting, I think, that scheme that in the past did get to about 1,000, take about 1,000 off the population, and that was worth doing, I think.
Thanks. Okay. Mr. Daly.
Gentlemen, one of the problems is, I don't know whether you feel this, you've been involved in this for a long time, when we talk about the backlog or we talk about prison places, I feel like I'm sort of 15, 18 years ago, and we're having a variation of the same conversation, because sometimes I think that point needs to be made, because this is not some new miraculous thing that's just suddenly appeared. This is something that's been there throughout the whole of the time that I've been involved in the criminal justice system. Now, I think that when you have a system where a main part is judicial discretion in terms of how you sentence people, and that is a general power that is given by Parliament, there is never going to be perfect answers in terms of how we build places, how many places are necessary, because if magistrates or judges want to send people to prison, they are going to send people to prison unless they are told they do not have the power to do it. And I don't know anybody who has proposed laws to stop that from happening. In terms of what the government are proposing at the moment, I know you'll have some questions in respect of that, in terms of suspended sentences. I think we're going to have a lot of sentences which are 13 months and things like that, in respect of that. So it is an effort to address a problem, but it is a problem that is forever thus. I wanted to come back to probation and to the issue regarding one of the things. I've been on this committee now for nearly 4 years, and one of the things that has become very clear is the risk averseness, if I can put it that way, of probation when it comes to assessing parole. And I think we frankly have far too many people in prison who have not committed further offences. And I don't know, gentlemen, whether you have the number. Do any of you have a rough idea of the number of those? I'm not asking you on the spot, but it's a huge number. And I just want to ask you, in terms of parole and even going into the Bail Act, those two issues make up a large proportion of the number of people that are inside prison at this moment in time. And they are not people who, in my view, are at risk of committing further offences. If you're in prison because you haven't turned up for an appointment with the probation service at 4 o'clock and you got there at 4:30, it just seems a bit strange. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think you make a very important point, and I think it's worth being clear about what is the risk that practitioners are averse to. So I think if they are averse to the risk of the individual concerned committing further harm and committing further crime, then they should be averse to that risk. But quite often I think what they're averse to is the personal and institutional reputational damage of a wrong decision. And I think that's more questionable. I mean, I've obviously sat in that chair. There is no way that with 100% accuracy you can predict somebody's future behaviour. It's the only way you're going to eliminate risk is not to release anybody. And I think there is a problem. I think we have to distinguish between situations where people take a properly considered opinion, can show they've done that, but nevertheless things don't work out as they hoped, right? And somebody who was reckless or didn't take appropriate care in making their decision. And I think there is a role for this committee, amongst others, in trying to make that distinction so that when practitioners are making decisions, they feel they can make the decision on the evidence of the risk to the public alone and not feel that they've got their commands and bosses breathing down their neck around the institutional risk.
And just getting on to Mr. Allen or Mr. Garside, it seems to me that we have an issue with remand, and remand could be related to the backlog, but I don't think it's just related to that. I think it's down to courts taking a very strict interpretation of the Bail Act, and I keep asking the question Bail Act ? As part of this, rather than necessarily discussing whether you're going to increase this sentence for that or this sentence for that. Do you think that we should be looking at the provisions of the Bail Act?
Well, I don't think we understand enough about the decisions that are made at that stage in proceedings. So generally people will be denied bail if a court thinks that they're a flight risk, if they're going to interfere with witnesses or evidence, or if they're going to commit more offences. But which of those reasons is the one that drives most of the remands to custody? We don't really know. If it's flight risk, electronic monitoring should be suitable for at least some of those, and the numbers of people on remand subject to electronic monitoring has increased, which I think is good. But I sense that there could be a greater use of electronic monitoring at the bail stage.
I think we need a lot more research, academic research into it, because I suspect we've got a lot of people who are in prison on remand for relatively minor offences who have very few offences committed on bail. I believe we've got people who are in custody at this moment in time who may have one failure to attend court, on their record. And this is new. We're not talking about one or two people. We're talking about substantial numbers of people. And I just feel that all of these issues are as relevant to whether we're increasing this sentence or the attitude of this. And I think perhaps you gentlemen may agree with me that we don't have clear enough information to make an informed decision as politicians as to how we potentially address those things at the moment.
But I mean, one of the things, again, we could do and should do, and I mean, this committee flagged this up in its recent report, is just ensuring that there is a much stricter adherence to remand, to the custody time limits on remand. Now, I understand clearly that the current problems have been massively exacerbated by COVID and the closure of the courts. But nonetheless, I mean, there always used to be a figure, from years ago, I haven't looked at this more recently, something like about half of all those on remand did not end up with a prison sentence, even if they'd been convicted. So there is something clearly going wrong at a certain level here. Individuals aren't, as it were, just individual carriers of risk either. So, part of the question there in terms of custodial remand or not remanding people in custody is what support is around them in the community to ensure that if they are, let's say, in a slightly chaotic or difficult state in their lives, they're getting the support they need in order, not to get into further trouble. But I think, again, just doing some of the basics right, just making sure that if someone is remanded to custody, we have a very strict adherence to time limits on custody. That would be a good start, without doing anything else, and would at least help to reduce the number of people who are languishing in custody, sometimes for months, if not years.
I'm now going to ask you very briefly the questions I was supposed to be asking you.
Sorry, can I just say very quickly on remand, because I think it's quite important. I think the figures have changed since you looked at them, Richard. Now about 80% of those remanded at magistrates' court were given an immediate custodial sentence when they're convicted, and it was 70% of those remanded at Crown Court. So it is quite a lot of people on remand would have been in prison if their case had been held more quickly. So it's not as, I think the figures have changed over time, but that may indicate the need for further research in a way you suggest, Mr. Daly.
You've touched on this, gentleman, and I just appreciate a brief response. You're not planning lawyers, so I'm not asking you to get into this, but is the government's commitment to deliver 20,000 prison places by the mid-2020s achievable? I think you've talked about the planning issues and various other things. Have you got anything to add to that in respect to that?
Well, I mean, I've looked at this over time, and I've never really been able to see in any one place a kind of master plan, if that's the right word, or an overarching document that says this is where these places are going to come from. And I don't know whether that's something you might want to ask. Clearly, there's about 10,000 envisaged through new builds. 2 are open, 1 is opening next year. The 4th has just been given the go-ahead, the Gartree one, and that leaves 2 outstanding, one of which there's a planning inquiry in March, the one up in Lancashire, and the decision on the Grendon one is due to be made at the end of this month. So they will get some of that. The more interesting, in a sense, that's 9,800 places altogether if they all get going.
It's amazing, Mr. Allen, when you're a politician, it's amazing how we talk about these things, and then suddenly a prison is proposed in the constituency, and as an MP you suddenly get lots and lots of letters from people objecting to the prison being in that particular constituency. So in terms of public policy, in terms of, should we say the general, or say pressure, because all MPs are clearly open-minded on these subjects, there is that to take into account as well, which I think is a...
Well, I think...
Just to be really clear, they have plans to build about 10,000 places, as Robert said. There is no plan that I'm aware of to create the other 10,000, which they've said they'll produce by 2025. It's just not... they aren't going to be able to do it.
Well, I think the Minister has indicated about over 8,000 by May 2025, so... I think the answer is no, they're not going to hit their 10,000.
I mean, there are a variety of schemes, accelerated house block scheme, brief house block scheme, Category D scheme. But I haven't ever seen on one sort of spreadsheet or paper, this is how we're going to produce these additional ones.
They didn't design me a prison and go and make a planning application, don't you really? That's the, on a bit of land that you own, that's basically the process.
If the population rises in line with the higher end of the projections, they are not going to be able to create the space to house those people in the time that's necessary. That's really, it's an arithmetical fact.
Yeah, you can't get around that.
The last 2 points, I'll take these two questions together. How effective is the Ministry of Justice's approach to ensuring the safe management of a growing prison population? To what extent can the government achieve safe and decent living conditions in overcrowded prisons? I went to visit Buckley Wells Prison, which is in Rochdale. If a prison can be described as a positive environment, that is it. I could talk about the good work that's happening there. I could go to Forest Bank or H&P Manchester. Very, very, very different environment, and very different environment in terms of the safety of prisoners. So, have you got any brief comments on that?
In the last 2 quarters, assaults have risen, for which they're published. It's very alarming. Of course, there is variance in performance. I think that has a lot to do with how easy it is to recruit staff and to do with the type of prison. But I think if you, as I've said in my submission, I was in Wandsworth Prison just prior to the escape, and it was, I just couldn't see how they could make it work. It was impossible. They didn't have the resources to do it.
Thanks very much. Okay. I don't know if any of you have come across the concept in planning of nationally significant infrastructure projects. Is there a case for treating prisons in that way? I wonder.
Well, I guess it's one of the factors that when applications are called in or appealed, that gets taken into account, the national significance of it. I mean, I know for this inquiry, I was looking through the evidence in preparing for this. I think the leader of Buckinghamshire Council has submitted evidence to this inquiry.
Indeed.
And makes some very interesting points about the impact of this huge number of prisoners in rural location, and makes some, I think, quite strong points about the impact of having a prison on, for example, the NHS, on the road network, on transportation, on traffic, and all of that. And the extent, I think, those are the things that's bread and butter in terms of planning decisions. But there seems to be a slight lack of confidence on the part of local people that actually, if you've got ambulances going into prisons once or twice a day because people have overdosed or whatever, that's one less ambulance available for the local community. And I think that's a not illegitimate concern.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. You talked about the increase in assaults. I was like your take on the effect overcrowding is having on the levels of self-harm and mental health.
Well, it's very obvious. If you go into prison, you can see it, and I think because one of the things, if you crowd people together in unsanitary conditions, that inevitably raises the level of stress, and that inevitably increases levels of self-harm and levels of and affects people's mental health. I think certainly in prisons, overcrowded prisons, I've been into recently. I've been into a lot of prisons in my career. It's only recently I've started to feel quite concerned about my own personal security when I've been into prisons. And that's not a surprise. You've got guys who are kind of banged up for 23 hours a day. They're just, they can get whatever substances they want, and they haven't got the staff to manage them. They're all out on the wing on association. And you think, maybe I'm just going to scuttle along the corridor and get out of here because it doesn't feel safe. And I pity the staff who work there and the impact this has on some of their mental health and well-being. So I think prisons, I'm not going around prisons to the extent I used to, but the ones I have been to, I would say, certainly in the autumn, were in a very, very volatile state. And I think that would affect prisoners themselves in terms of their mental health and self-harm. It certainly affected staff and was obvious to see.
And of course, the overcrowding means that there are fewer staff available to respond to those problems that prisoners have. So we have a scheme in the prison system, the so-called ACT scheme, which is a sort of suicide and self-harm prevention scheme. On paper, it's a very good kind of world-leading scheme, but it is quite staff-intensive. And for the people who are presenting most risk, it involves having very frequent meetings, exchanging information, checking on people, and all of that. that is so much more difficult if you've got too many prisoners and too few staff, and there are countless examples of that.
And often, and quite a lot, certainly some of the inner city prisons, the staff that are there are very inexperienced and new, quite young. And so developing those kinds of, that dynamic security where you've got a relationship with the prisoners, it's in both your interest to keep the place calm and working well. You haven't got people with the experience necessarily to do that. It's an alarming situation, I think.
And building on that, with the likely increase in prison population, then will there be then the commensurate increase in poor mental health?
Yes.
I'm
sure you will inevitably see that, I think. And you can see it, I think. And if you talk to, experienced prison officers, the ones that are left, that's what they would say. They would say that the people they are dealing with are now different from the people they were dealing with before, and to some extent even very experienced people will tell you they're beyond their skills to deal with. They aren't, they're not mental health nurses.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so final point on that, any suggestions around how government could better manage prisoners with poor mental health in these more overcrowded establishments?
And I think your question presumes the answer, and one answer is, well, you don't have overcrowded establishments. I think we've, if you know prisons, you have the kind of the so-called certified normal accommodation. That's what this prison should have, and then you have the operational capacity. And far too many prisons are operating at operational capacity levels rather than certified normal accommodation. And so, if we can get back to a point where actually prisons are more as a matter of standard operating at certified normal accommodation rather than operational capacity, it becomes possible to do other things. Prisoners don't kind of feel as crammed into cells. Prisons aren't themselves making judgments about cell sharing, which maybe is not appropriate because actually these prisoners shouldn't be put in the same cell together. And it's going to be easier to actually get the services to prisoners they need. But for as long as we're in this situation of just ongoing overcrowding, which we then accept as just the norm, rather than what should be is the exception, then, it's not going to get better.
I think what I would say that's perhaps slightly more kind of optimistic is I don't think you need to do much in terms of population to make the situation quite a lot more manageable. When there was not the same degree of overcrowding, what prison managers were able to do was manage where their population was in their prison. So you could have a wing that was a bit quieter, where the people are finding it a bit more difficult to cope. You could put them. You could make sure you have a bit of space on your first night wing for longer term prisoners who had simply not adapted to life on the wings. You could start to do all those things, or you could put a prisoner who was struggling a bit with someone you felt might keep an eye on them, look after. You could start to do those sorts of things. You knew your prisoners, you could work with the prisoners to make it work. But but if actually what you're doing is you're operating at kind of 99% capacity, which they are now, you simply have to put people where there's a space. Bring it down just a little bit and you start to get that flexibility back where you can make it work better. So there's a danger if almost that we sort of go along with that nothing can be done. I think you can do things, and actually some relatively small reductions in the population, which I guess actually I'd be interested to see the next set of safety figures after there has been a bit of a reduction in the population. I think that will give them a bit more scope, the better governors, to be a bit more creative about how they're managing their population.
Yeah, and if you bring it down a little bit more than that, you can start to be more proactive and perhaps create more therapeutic wings, psychologically informed environments were created, sort of special units, but they're characterised by relatively smaller numbers of prisoners and relatively larger numbers of prison staff and healthcare staff. And of course, those are luxuries in the current kind of population climate that can't be done. So I think, I agree. I think we could look to a brighter future, but it does depend on getting these numbers under control.
Talking of capacity, but also having a good prison estate, and what are the impacts of the sort of over the medium to longer term of deferring sort of non-urgent maintenance to meet some of these short-term capacity demands and pressures? What sort of impact is that having?
Well, one of the things I've become a bit concerned about in recent years is the question of fire risk in prisons. I think the Lord Chancellor told you that there are about 1,500 places out of commission when he gave evidence to you because of essential fire work going on to install proper alarms and spraying systems and so on. I mean, if you look at the last HMPPS report, it's something like 28,000 places don't meet current fire safety standards. And that annual report says capacity pressures have restricted our ability to take places out of use for refurbishment and compliance works. Now, I would be very concerned if we have reached the point where the fire safety order is not being complied with and people are being placed at risk. And I've argued for some time that I think, perhaps this committee should perhaps look into that question. The Crown Premises Fire Safety Inspectorate produced its latest report recently, which gives information about the numbers of there's 1,000 call-outs from fire services to prisons each year. So I think that's an underappreciated risk and safety issue that I think, and so I'd be very concerned about maintenance being deferred on something as essential as that. Clearly, I read a report last week where it said that because of the need to keep cells in use, cells weren't getting a repaint before, so they're covered in graffiti. I mean, it's not nice for a prisoner to come into a cell that's covered in offensive graffiti. It should be covered over and painted. But to me, that's a different order of magnitude to the fire issue.
Yeah. I think there's. I agree with that. I think the fire risk is something that needs attention. Two other things I would just say, which are linked to your question. I mean, one is I think about the adaptations that are necessary, the use of the space that makes it manageable for an increasingly elderly and infirm prison population. So I think that's one of the issues around the kind of, these old Victorian prisons where you've got to go up 3 flights of narrow metal stairs to get to your cell. That has big implications for the population as it now is. I think the other thing that links to Rob's point about fire, but might also link to disturbances or otherwise, I mean, one of the worries I've got about the system at the moment is it's got absolutely no capacity for any contingencies. Were something to happen, that would take us a few hundred places out of use, which might be, which would be a fire. Let's say nobody's hurt, but still that you lose space, or you've got a disturbance in a prison or whatever it might be, right? They would then have a real problem. They have not got, at the moment, as I'm aware of, any contingency or something going badly wrong and them losing and a significant number of places coming out of use. And we know, historically, that does happen at difficult to predict intervals, and I think that should be a real concern and something we should be asking Mr. Hester about. What's your contingency plan?
I mean, just on specifically on maintenance, I mean, I think the Public Accounts Committee found in 2020 that about 500 places are taken out of use each year because they're basically due to poor conditions. And we also know that there's a maintenance backlog. It's at least £1 billion, probably more now, because I think that estimate was done in 2021. So maybe £2 or £3 billion worth of maintenance backlog. Now, so, the longer that kind of stuff is deferred, then the more problems you're storing up for the future. And more difficult you actually find it to meet your long-term capacity demands. Because if you are deferring routine maintenance, the risk is that you are losing more capacity more quickly, which then makes it more difficult for you to actually maintain the long-term capacity that you need. I mean, partly to deal with any just immediate urgent situations, but just more generally to have a properly planned and strategically managed estate.
What effect has the contracting out of estates maintenance contracts had on the quality of the estate?
Well, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? I mean, I think about there's still one company that's doing some of the maintenance and some of it's been bought in-house. I haven't haven't seen anything to suggest there's been a transformative impact of that, but I don't, Nick or Rob might.
And I noticed that it's been out to date, but say when I was looking at it, it was just it was just so difficult for prison governors to get things done, to get simple things done, because you'd have some argument about, is this like routine wear and tear, or is it vandalism, or those sorts of things. And so you'd have governors like tied down, trying to sort out often quite minor maintenance issues and argue about the contract. So I think, now that may have, I don't know, that I'm talking quite historically, it'd be probably better to ask Charlie Taylor some of that, but as far as I'm aware, it's still a problem, but my knowledge isn't very up to date.
No final question, really. You touched on the Victorian era sort of prisons with the metal stairs. The Chief Inspector of Prisons has called for the closure of 1 in 10 prisons in England and Wales, particularly the Victorian era inner city jails, which aren't fit for purpose. Do you agree, or are there any benefits of those purpose-built Victorian prisons?
I do agree with him, simply because of the physical state of those buildings and what it would cost to repair them and their inability to have modern IT systems, etc., etc. So I don't disagree. I would say, though, that there are a couple of things about the Victorian prisons that are worth bearing in mind. One is they're comparatively small compared with what we're building now, and that seems to me a strength. Two is their accessibility. Families and friends could get them. And 3, despite all the difficulties, quite often, in my experience, prisoners quite like those Victorian prisons. One of the reasons for it was because of the design. Gave you clear sight lines. It didn't feel as threatening as some more modern prisons where you've got lots of corners and stairs and you're worried someone's going to jump out at you. So I don't think the current Victorian, most of it, is redeemable. Simply it's in too bad a state of repair. But there were some things that the Victorians got right, and so there's a bit of a baby in a bathwater issue in there, I think.
Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, we are in a Victorian era building, I think. So I think the notion that Victorian era buildings, or indeed Victorian era prisons, are somehow a bad thing, I think needs some thought. And I mean, just to really partly echoing what Nick was saying, I mean, a lot of these Victorian era prisons are, they're in areas of high population. They're often connected up with other criminal justice services, the courts and other things. And if the alternative to that is building these large warehouse prisons, sometimes several miles away from any population settlement, in the teeth of local opposition, that doesn't strike me as being a particularly sensible policy either. So I myself am very much in favour of closing 1 in 10 prisons, because I think we need a much smaller prison population than we currently have, and I think that would be a positive thing for the country and for the general public. But, whether the Victoria era prisons are the things to close, I mean, I think they probably do require a lot of maintenance, but I think some long-term investment in some of these buildings, and appropriate repurposing where needed. But, let's just make sure we don't replace them with, 3,000 place, monsters on a brownfield site, in the middle of nowhere.
I think each one needs to be considered. I mean, I understand that this Victorian building is potentially having to close down while it undergoes substantial repairs, and that's probably the case with some of these prisons. I mean, Swansea is often put forward as a small, almost like a community prison, actually, because most of the people are from there, most of the staff are from there. It's small, and even though there's all sorts of things objectively that aren't very good about the conditions, prisoners rate it quite highly, staff rate it quite highly. So I think Richard and Nick are right. You don't want to sort of... I'm not sure Charlie did say that they should be closed down. I think he said sort of ideally over time one might want to move towards looking at the ones that have a part to play. But I think it needs to be... It's not as straightforward as perhaps it seems.
Yeah, no. This Victorian era building has its issues sometimes, but it's got its advantages. Understood. But, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your evidence.